The time for warning has passed. The time for vengeance has arrived. On June 15th, Vladimir Putin made the worst mistake of his entire war. He launched a massive strike against Ukrainian cities and destroyed a cathedral that had been standing in Kyiv for nearly 1,000 years, a monastery that survived the Mongol invasion, a monastery that survived 2 world wars, and now Putin tried to burn it to the ground. But here is the part Putin did not think through. Zelensky had warned him for months. If Russia kept attacking Ukrainian civilians, the response would not stay inside Ukraine. The response would come home. It would come home to Moscow. And less than 72 hours after the cathedral burned, that warning became reality twice over. This is Daily Brief, and in this video, we are going to walk you through exactly what happened, how Putin's worst miscalculation came home to bite him not once, but in 2 of the largest drone strikes Moscow has ever seen. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will understand why Russian officials are now admitting, for the first time since the war began, that their own oil production is collapsing. Before we go any further, if you have not subscribed to Daily Brief yet, now is the time. We cover this war every single day, and stories like this one move fast. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Let's start from the beginning. The night of June 15th was one of the most terrifying nights Ukraine has experienced in this entire war. That night, Russia launched more than 600 drones and dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities. At least 5 civilians were killed, more than 35 were injured. But the body count is not what made this attack unique. It was the target Russia chose. At some point during that assault, a Russian drone reached the Kyiv-Pechorsk Lavra, a monastery complex in the heart of the Ukrainian capital. Inside that complex stands the Dormition Cathedral, a structure that has been standing since the 11th century. Founded in the year 1051 by a monk named Anthony and his disciple Theodosius, the Lavra is the oldest monastic complex of Kievan Rus, the very civilization both Ukraine and Russia claim as their ancestor. The Kyiv-Pechorsk Lavra complex gained UNESCO World Heritage List status in 1990. This is not just an old building. This is one of the most sacred sites in all of Orthodox Christianity, a place pilgrims have traveled to for nearly 1,000 years to view shrines and relics found nowhere else on Earth, and Putin chose this structure as his target. While the monastery burned, priests inside were racing to save what they could. Frontline footage from that night shows a priest sprinting through smoke, carrying sacred crosses out of the building as police officers scan the sky for incoming drones. A reporter standing outside the burning cathedral, 4 in the morning, firefighters everywhere, said it plainly. This is not about land. This is not about territory. This is what Putin's so-called holy war actually looks like. The reaction was instant, and it was global. Other cultural sites were targeted as well, including a historic film studio and an art museum in Kyiv, and Ukrainian officials said the attack was one of Russia's large-scale strikes on the capital that also damaged other cultural institutions. As reported by the Kyiv Independent, the Director General of the Kyiv-Pechorsk Lavra National Reserve said there had been no critical overheating of the roof, and that if it had overheated, the structure could have collapsed inward. In other words, Ukraine came within inches of losing 1,000 years of history in a single night. Western leaders condemned the strike almost immediately. According to Angelus News, Bishop Vitaly Krivitsky of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Kyiv-Zhytomyr called it an inhumane attack on the Ukrainian capital by Russian forces and pointed out the bitter irony of so-called Orthodox Russia destroying Orthodox shrines. He predicted correctly that Russia would blame Ukrainian air defense for the damage, and that is exactly what happened. Kremlin-aligned accounts spent hours in silence after the strike, because even some of Russia's own supporters had no defense for what Putin had just done. Then the explanation arrived. This was not a Russian drone, they claimed. This was an American-made missile that Ukraine had fired by accident, and it just happened to land on one of the holiest sites in Eastern Christianity. There was just one problem. Investigators recovered the wreckage. What they found were components of a Russian Juran-2 drone, the same kamikaze drone manufactured in Russia's Alabuga Special Economic Zone, which has effectively become the industrial heartland of Russia's drone war. The serial numbers, the components, everything matched a Russian weapon, not an American one. The Kremlin's excuse was a lie, manufactured within hours of the strike. This is frankly nothing new. As President Harry Truman once put it when asked whether he trusted the Russians, his answer was simple. No, because in his words, they broke every agreement they ever made. Now, there is some good news buried in this story, and we will get to it later in the video. But first, let's talk about how Ukraine responded, because this is not 2022 anymore. This is 2026. Ukraine is no longer a country that simply absorbs Russian strikes and waits. Ukraine hits back. And in the 72 hours that followed the attack on the Lavra, Ukraine hit back twice, each time harder than Russia's defenses were prepared for. Here is where the story gets bigger than even the original reporting suggested, because what started as a single retaliatory strike on June 16th turned into something far larger by June 18th. As reported by NBC News, waves of Ukrainian drones struck a major oil refinery in Moscow for the second time in a week, sending smoke and flames rising over the city through the morning, while local commercial flights were also disrupted. The outlet went further, noting that Moscow was shrouded in thick black smoke as Ukraine launched what appeared to be its largest attack on the city since the Kremlin's full-scale invasion began more than 4 years earlier. And crucially, the framing was unmistakable. Kyiv cast the attack as revenge for the strikes on the historic monastery that had drawn global condemnation. Let's talk about the target itself, because this is where it gets genuinely staggering. The site is the Moscow oil refinery located in the Kapotnya district on the southeastern edge of the Russian capital, operated by the state energy giant Gazprom Neft. This is not some minor regional facility. This refinery processes around 13 million tons of crude oil every single year. It supplies roughly 40% of the fuel consumed in Moscow and the surrounding region, 50% of the diesel, and overall meets about 70% of the gasoline needs of the Russian capital. 1 in every 3 cars in Moscow runs on fuel that came out of this plant. Even the bitumen used to repair Moscow's roads comes from here. And this entire facility sits just 15 kilometers, less than 10 miles, from the Kremlin itself, the building where Putin is presumed to be hiding, though we genuinely do not know for certain because he prefers to keep his location a secret. Now remember, this refinery sits inside what is supposed to be one of the most heavily defended airspaces on the planet. Multiple concentric rings of air defense surround Moscow specifically because Putin has been terrified of exactly this kind of strike. And despite all of that, Ukrainian drones got through, not once, twice in a single week. According to ABC News, Ukraine launched hundreds of drones on Thursday, targeting more than a dozen Russian regions, including Moscow, where they struck the oil refinery and sent plumes of black smoke into the air over the Russian capital, with Russia's Ministry of Defense reporting that the country's air defenses destroyed some 555 drones in the early morning hours, about 180 of which were intercepted as they approached Moscow itself, according to Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, who gave the update via Telegram. Think about that math for a second. 555 drones shot down, and Russia is presenting that as a victory. But you do not need 180 drones converging on a single city if your enemy cannot reach you in the first place. The sheer scale of this barrage tells you everything about how seriously Ukraine is now contesting Russian airspace. State news agency TASS, of all sources, was forced to admit the scale of it. As reported by NBC News, TASS called it the most massive drone attack on the Moscow region in 2 years. Even the Kremlin's own mouthpiece could not spin this one away. The human toll inside Russia, while far smaller than what Ukraine endures regularly, was real. Sobyanin said the fire at the refinery had largely been extinguished and that no one there was hurt, though 17 people were injured across the wider Moscow region, including 2 children, according to Regional Governor Andrei Vorobyov, while the Moscow region's ecology ministry advised residents in several communities to stay indoors and wear masks as a precaution, even as it said air quality readings were within normal range. CBS News reported additional damage, noting that a drone hit a residential building in the town of Zhukovsky outside Moscow, prompting an evacuation, while drone debris elsewhere damaged private houses, a car, a fitness center, an industrial facility, and a large shopping mall whose roof caught fire, according to Governor Vorobyov. And then there is the political timing, which is almost too perfect to be coincidental. As CBS News pointed out, the attack came as the latest embarrassment for Putin following an earlier Ukrainian drone strike on his hometown of St. Petersburg, which happened just as he was hosting a showcase economic forum there with foreign VIP guests. And on the very day of this latest Moscow strike, Putin was hundreds of miles away in Kazan, hosting leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in an attempt to shore up business ties with the region. While Putin was busy trying to project strength to his Asian guests, his own capital was burning behind him. Ukraine's president did not stay quiet about why this was happening. As reported by CBS News, Zelensky stated on social media that this was a fully justified response to Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities and communities, and another important result of Ukrainian forces working against the facilities that sustain Russia's war machine. And in comments that made headlines around the world, Zelensky said plainly that unless Putin stops his war, Moscow will burn. This is where I want you to pause and really sit with the contrast here because it matters. Ukraine's own prime minister laid out the distinction in stark terms in a public statement following the strikes. Unlike Russia, Ukraine does not target thousand-year-old cradles of Eastern Christianity. Ukraine targets the economic foundations that finance Moscow's war machine. We are not the same. Ukraine wants an end to this war and a just, lasting peace. That is the entire dichotomy of this conflict in one sentence. Putin started this war believing he would take Kyiv in 3 days. 4 years later, he is losing control of the narrative, the battlefield, and now, increasingly, his own capital's skyline. Ukraine, meanwhile, even as it grows stronger and more capable by the month, remains disciplined in what it chooses to hit. Refineries, military supply lines, the arteries of war, not the symbols of faith. If Putin were thinking clearly, he would recognize that his own strategy of bombing Ukrainian civilians is backfiring on two fronts simultaneously. Every strike on a Ukrainian city only hardens Ukrainian resolve, and every Ukrainian retaliatory strike on Russian energy infrastructure turns ordinary Russians, people with no say in Kremlin decision-making, against this war. It is, in effect, a vice closing in on the Russian war machine from both directions at once. If you are finding this breakdown useful, this is exactly the kind of analysis Daily Brief publishes daily. Make sure you are subscribed because we are about to get into the numbers, and the numbers are where this story becomes truly staggering. Let's talk about the broader campaign because the Kapotnya strikes were not isolated incidents. They are part of a sustained, months-long Ukrainian strategy to bleed Russia's oil sector dry, and the evidence that it is working is now coming directly from Russian officials themselves. In May alone, Ukraine struck Russian oil refineries on 16 separate occasions, hitting 8 of Russia's top 10 refineries by volume. When you widen the count to include strikes on oil depots, storage facilities, and other petroleum infrastructure, the total climbs to roughly 30 strikes in a single month. That averages out to nearly 1 strike every single day for the entire month of May. According to Beefeater Research, this campaign did not start this year. Ukraine has conducted a sustained campaign of strikes on Russia's oil infrastructure throughout 2025, with intensity increasing especially from summer into autumn, and Reuters and industry sources estimate that at least 17 major refineries were struck by Ukrainian drones and missiles that year, with some Ukrainian reports counting well over 100 attacks on oil facilities when broader energy targets are included. The analysis notes that at peak disruption, roughly 17 to 20% of Russia's refining capacity was taken offline due to combined Ukrainian attacks and scheduled maintenance. Now, here is where it gets genuinely historic. For years, Russia has refused to admit any of this is working. The Kremlin's strategy has always been to bury the damage in vague language and hope nobody connects the dots. That changed earlier this month. Speaking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, the man who represents Russia at OPEC Plus negotiations, made what energy analysts are calling the first official Russian admission that Ukrainian strikes are degrading the country's oil production. As reported by oilprice.com, Novak's words appear to be the first public admission from Russia that intensified Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries are reducing local domestic refining production. Novak himself told reporters on the sidelines of the forum that Russia's oil production is indeed lower compared to the beginning of 2026, attributing this to a number of refineries currently undergoing what he called unscheduled repairs, while claiming Russia is maximizing the use of its export infrastructure. Unscheduled repairs. Let that phrase sink in for a moment because we are going to come back to it, because Russian state media is using almost identical language to hide the exact same truth from its own population. The Indexbox news service added important context here. noting that in response to falling refining output, Russia has increased crude exports, though Ukraine has also targeted Baltic Sea and Black Sea export terminals, and that earlier in the same week, Russia imposed a ban on jet fuel exports running through November 30th, 2026, specifically aiming to secure domestic fuel supply amid the escalating drone campaign. Think about what that means. This is the world's third largest oil producer, a nation sitting on some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves on the planet, and it has now banned jet fuel exports for nearly 6 months just to keep enough fuel inside its own borders. That is not the behavior of a country that is winning an energy war. That is the behavior of a country in crisis management. And the crisis goes back further than this single admission suggests. According to Al Jazeera's reporting from earlier this year, the damage to Russia's energy export capacity had already become severe by April. April exports were so weakened that Russia was forced to cut crude production by 300,000 to 400,000 barrels a day, according to calculations from Reuters that were backed by 5 separate sources. The same report cited Sweden's military intelligence chief Thomas Nilsson, who told the Financial Times that Russia would need oil prices to remain above $100 a barrel for the rest of the year simply to address its budget deficit. Oil prices have not stayed consistently above that threshold, which means Russia's fiscal math is not adding up. Now let's bring this back to ordinary Russians, because numbers on a spreadsheet do not capture what this actually looks like on the ground. Moscow and St. Petersburg, two of the wealthiest and most developed cities in the entire country, are now openly rationing fuel. Gas stations are capping how much gasoline a single driver can purchase. Footage circulating from Moscow shows residents being told they can buy a maximum of 20 liters of gasoline per car, 40 liters for diesel, and a flat 200-liter cap for trucks. One driver, attempting to fill a 65-liter tank with only 68 kilometers of range left, was turned away and told 20 liters was the absolute limit. This is the capital of a country that holds some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, and its own citizens cannot fill their gas tanks. Kilometer-long queues have formed at gas stations along the highway connecting St. Petersburg to Moscow. Residents in footage circulating online describe the situation as something out of a nightmare, openly stating they never expected fuel rationing to reach their own neighborhoods. One resident put it succinctly: "You live in a country overflowing with gasoline resources, and you are limited in how much you can buy. That, in their own words, is a bad situation." Here is the part that should worry the Kremlin most. Ordinary Russians are beginning to realize that their own state media is not telling them the truth. When one of the largest drone attacks in Moscow's history takes place, you would expect it to dominate the news. Instead, Russian outlets buried it. One report referenced only, quote, "unscheduled repairs at Russian oil refineries, putting pressure on stock prices in the oil industry," without ever mentioning a Ukrainian drone attack by name. That phrase, unscheduled repairs, has now become a kind of dark code among Russians who follow the news closely, a way of describing a drone strike without ever using the word drone, or the word Ukraine, or the word strike. Another Russian outlet, while avoiding direct mention of the refinery strike, did concede that the night of June 15th into June 16th was, in its words, a tough one for the Moscow region, which came under serious attack by Ukrainian drones that shattered windows in apartment blocks and set roofs on fire, injuring 6 people. The same report noted, almost as an aside, that Ukraine had for the first time used advanced drones capable of operating in difficult weather conditions, including rain, during these strikes on the Moscow region. On the economic side, the picture being painted even by Russia's own financial press is bleak. One report acknowledged that Russia's federal budget is under genuine strain, noting that a temporary jump in oil and gas revenue in May, driven by an unrelated crisis in the Middle East, was already being eaten away by a strong ruble, mounting oil discounts, and persistent logistics vulnerabilities. In the first 5 months of 2026 alone, revenues from Russia's oil sector reportedly fell by 30% compared to the prior year. 30% from the sector that funds Putin's entire war effort. Now let's circle back to where we started, because I promised you some good news, and this is a story we genuinely do not get to tell often enough. The Dormition Cathedral at the Kyiv Pечерsk Lavra, The building Russia tried to destroy on June 15th is recovering. Restoration crews moved in almost immediately. According to footage from the site, the bells of the Lavra have already started ringing again. Priests have resumed their normal routines inside the complex. Fire crews extinguished the blaze at the nearby Mistetsky Arsenal building, and initial restoration work there has already begun as well. As one witness on the ground put it, the bells ringing in the Lavra mean that everything will keep working, that the city of Kyiv is alive, and that no amount of Russian bombing is capable of destroying a city with this much history behind it. Every morning, the city begins healing its wounds again. There is a deeper layer to why Russia targeted this particular site, and it is worth understanding because it tells you something about how Moscow thinks about this entire war. As explained in an analysis published by The Conversation from 2009 onward, following a leadership change inside the Russian Orthodox Church, Russia began explicitly tying religious politics to its neo-imperialist state ideology, and Russia's historic influence over the Pechersk-Lavra site was fundamentally about controlling Ukrainian self-determination and religious freedom. But that influence ended years ago. As of January 2023, all worship inside the monastery has been conducted exclusively under the Independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which formally split from the Moscow Patriarchate back in 2019. In other words, Russia no longer controls this site spiritually, politically, or institutionally. Striking it was not a military necessity. It was an act of resentment against a symbol Moscow has already lost. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank that has tracked this conflict daily since its earliest hours, offered its own read on Russian motives. As reported by Prism News, the Institute assessed on June 16th that the strike on the Lavra likely had both military and psychological aims intended to pressure Ukraine and sap national morale. If that was the goal, it backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking Ukrainian morale, the strike triggered the largest Ukrainian retaliation against Moscow's oil infrastructure in years, twice over within a single week. Before we wrap up, this is exactly the kind of pattern Daily Brief exists to track. Cause and effect, strike and counterstrike, the actual numbers behind the headlines, not just the headlines themselves. If that is the kind of analysis you want delivered to you regularly, the subscribe button is right there, and turning on notifications means you will see the next part of this story the moment it breaks, because at the pace this war is escalating, the next part is coming soon. Let's zoom out and look at the big picture one more time, because this is bigger than just 2 strikes on one refinery in 1 week. This is a sustained, deliberate, increasingly effective Ukrainian campaign to strip away the financial foundation of Russia's war machine. Not through territorial battles in the Donbass, not through trench warfare, through fuel, through refining capacity, through the literal economic bloodstream that allows Russian tanks to move, Russian jets to fly, and Russian artillery shells to reach the front line. And Russia, for the first time since this war began, is being forced to publicly admit that it is working. A senior Russian official stood on a stage at an international economic forum and told the world, in carefully chosen language, that Russian oil production has fallen. A government that has spent 4 years insisting it controls every variable of this war just admitted out loud that it does not control its own oil fields anymore. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians are standing in kilometer-long lines for gasoline in the capital city of one of the largest oil-producing nations on Earth. They are starting to ask questions their own state media refuses to answer honestly. And every time Putin orders another strike on a Ukrainian city, on a hospital, on an apartment block, or now on a 1,000-year-old cathedral, he is handing Ukraine more justification, more international sympathy, and ultimately more long-range strike authorization from its Western partners to keep doing exactly what it just did to Kapotnya. Putin wanted Kyiv in 3 days. 4 years later, he cannot even guarantee that his own capital's airspace will be clear by morning. That is not victory. That is a war that has, in every measurable sense, come home to Moscow. This is Daily Brief. If you want the full picture on this war, the strikes, the economic pressure, the diplomacy, and everything the headlines leave out, make sure you are subscribed and notifications are turned on, because we will be back with the next development the moment it happens. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.